having that blanket, that cushion financially afterwards is something that takes a lot of stress off of people. That's the whole point of life insurance, right? And to have that taken away over, you know, a bias or a mistake on a autopsy report, um, caused all of these problems for us.
So we had to hire an independent medical examiner to essentially go through the autopsy and all of the case file, photos, history, etc., and make a determination if he thought that this was a viable case or not.
We have the independent medical examiner's review.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going.
Okay, we're gonna jump right back into it. Last episode we got into the nitty-gritty of the autopsy and um what the outcome of that was, how the death certificate was not completely accurate. And the big thing with that is that it definitely affected our um, ability to collect on some of the life insurance, which is what we needed. So, besides the fact that it just was difficult to see that this thing was inaccurate and not a complete picture of what actually happened according to the autopsy, um, it also just impacted like our ability to get life insurance that we needed in order to deal with all of this.
Well, people don't realize that when somebody dies, it's expensive. You have so
Yes.
many things that come up, like, the funeral costs, and then you have, dealing with all of these places. We touched on it a little bit, kind of at the beginning of the podcast, but there's all of these things that happen when somebody dies, and everybody expects their money right away. And it's like, you know, and especially when you lose a family head like that, who was was the breadwinner of the family, who, you
Yeah,
know,
I mean, he made the
we relied
primary.
on his income.
Yeah, I mean, he made you know, the primary income. I made a decent amount, but I was also in nursing school.
Mhm.
And then
You
also
weren't
after,
working as much at that time.
right, as someone, well, and because of nursing school, but then also, after something traumatic like that happens, it's not like you're jumping right back into work. And I know
Mhm.
that there are a lot of people out there that have to do that, that they don't have a choice. And I can't
Mhm.
even imagine having to go through that experience and then having to uproot everything, having to go back to work right away. Because it's just, probably one of the most devastating things that I've ever experienced in my life. Um, so I have a lot of empathy for people out there that don't have anything in place and have to deal with the aftermath of something like this. Because
Yeah.
a lot of people too, when it doesn't affect them personally, it's not that they're not sympathetic or empathetic, but it's not something that's on their minds. They're not thinking about that stuff. And so, yeah, so it was partially, the fact that I don't like things to be incorrect, or inaccurate. I would say I have kind of a strong sense of justice. And then this is a person I cared about, and I knew, the details behind the story of, probably what happened. And then the autopsy itself um supports the theory. And well, honestly, it just says that it was an accident, but the medical examiner's ruling, you know was not interpreted the way that the autopsy report was laid out.
Right. Well, and the thing was too is we were prepared. Like, this was something that you and dad were prepared for. An accidental, like, if he died in an accidental way, on a work trip or whatever, like that was something, that was the reason why you had these insurance policies, was just in case. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what ended up happening in our case, which is, goes to show that preparation can help a lot. But because the death certificate, well, because the autopsy ruled it as acute, and the chronic part is the part that makes it, change the death certificate. So because it was ruled as chronic alcohol abuse, that was ruled as a natural death.
Mhm.
And we'll get into, we have actually a second medical examiner's opinion that we had to get um, later on, but there's a difference when they rule whether it was an accidental death, a purposeful death, or a natural death. Like, there's different criteria in those things,
Mhm.
and an overdose of any kind typically is an accidental death.
Yeah.
But like a chronic abuse would be, that's part of your lifestyle, to the point where it eventually would cause some sort of disease that you would die from. So like if he had liver failure because he was drinking so much, or he had, pancreatitis that caused, some sort of issue that he eventually died from as a result of that disease, and not, you know, the alcohol overdose itself.
Mhm.
Um, then it would have been more of a natural death, but he died of alcohol poisoning, of an overdose. And that was unintentional, and it was an accident. And so, but because it was ruled the way that it was on the death certificate, immediately all of the safety plan, most of the safety plans that you had in place for the event of him dying were thrown out the window by the insurance companies. And
Correct.
so,
And I think the lesson I learned from that going forward is if I'm going to spend money, I mean, yeah, if your work provides coverage, it is great you have it, but I think we bought extra coverage on that because again, the likelihood of him dying in some sort of accident was a lot higher at that age. And I think the lesson I learned is that, if I'm going to spend any of my own money on a life insurance policy, it's going to be straight up, you know, like life insurance, not an accidental death policy, because that insurance is set up to find every loophole possible to not pay out. Whereas when you have life insurance, just straight up life insurance, it doesn't matter what they died from. I think the only thing I think that it might matter is if it's self inflicted. Um, and then
yeah,
I
no,
think
that
life
changes
insurance
it.
is affected. But I mean, if someone just dies, regardless of the cause of death, outside of that, life insurance, that was the thing that we didn't have to do anything for. It was like as soon as we provided the death certificate, that was paid out. So the fight really came from having the accidental death and disability policies. And
And the
we
death
had,
certificate saying that it was a natural
and
death, so
the
they
death certificate
immediately
saying,
ruled it
yeah.
out.
Yeah. And then it was, and that was a majority of where we had focused our policy, um,
Mhm.
collection on. So yeah, so it was really devastating to have to deal with that afterwards on top of everything else, and knowing that it's just inaccurate. Like again, if he really had died from something that was not considered an accident, let's say he had a heart attack or whatever, again, we would have dealt with it. We're resilient people. So, we would have done what was necessary and had to deal with that if that had happened.
Mhm.
But I didn't want to have to do that, especially as a mother. A lot of my focus was on you and not wanting to uproot your life even further. So, and then you put on top of it that it should have been a non-issue, and because this particular medical examiner, for whatever reason, interpreted and put his spin on it and, in my opinion, didn't take the facts objectively from the autopsy, it caused a problem for us. And so I had to look for a lot of I had to go through a lot of lawyers, which we'll get into more, in depth after. We're gonna jump into, so one of the things when I finally did find a lawyer, which was a very long and hard process, um, he was very much exactly what I thought. He was just like, "This is very clearly an accidental death," and he was willing to take on the case, but he did say that the one thing that we had to pay for and get, right away, or we're not going to be able to fight the insurance companies, was an independent second opinion on the medical exam. So we had to hire an independent medical examiner to essentially go through the autopsy and all of the case file, photos, history, etc., and make a determination if he thought that this was a viable case or not, like if the ruling of his death was inaccurate, and then which he did make that determination, and then he wrote up an independent report that supported his conclusion one way or the other, which again his conclusion was that it was an accidental death. So that did help us ultimately fight the insurance, but it was a long process, and again, like Isaac was saying, it's not like life stopped and, bills stopped and all that stuff. So it was definitely, I mean, obviously the initial life insurance after 3.5 months helped a little bit. It put a little buffer there. But yeah, I mean, it was not it was an extra added stress that was unnecessary given the circumstances. So
Well,
you wanna oh go ahead.
and I think, well, I was just gonna point in there, like, I think that we happen to be in a fairly fortunate situation with that. Not obviously like we were in a terrible situation, but the fact that you even knew or had an inkling that the initial determination that was on his death certificate was incorrect, and that you were willing and in that state determined to get the correct solution, so that the fact that we even had that knowledge in the first place was, I would say, very lucky or fortunate for us, because if we
Mhm.
didn't, if you weren't a nurse, perhaps we would have just gone along with what the autopsy said and then not been able to pursue any of this, and we would have had to uproot everything in our life, you know what I mean? Like
Maybe.
there's a lot of people who wouldn't think twice about that, about in this sort of situation. And this is obviously like a very specific situation, right? Um but these things do happen, and you have to be on the lookout for them, because um especially with certain things like life insurance and just insurance in general, they literally have it in their policies to do whatever they can to not pay out when they are supposed to.
Especially
And so
those
then
types of
it's
policies.
right, but even car insurance or homeowners insurance, all of those types of policies, the insurance companies in their own like company policies literally have it written out to try to find every possible way not to pay out their policies. Um, and so then it's on you to fight that most of the time. And a lot of people don't have the time, energy, or resources to do so. And so we were fortunate to be in a position to have the knowledge and the ability to actually fight, and get what we were, again, rightly owed, like legally.
Yeah, and I think obviously being a nurse helped, but I also think that in general I was fairly medically literate, I guess is the best way
Hmm.
to put it, even prior to becoming a nurse. Some of that was part of why I was interested in the medical field, but I've dealt with a lot of medical stuff with my family for a long time. So like I think that I would have figured it out anyways because I just again it wouldn't have made sense to me, and even if I
Hmm.
didn't automatically know how to read that, I still would have probably fought to understand it because that's just the type of person I am. If I don't understand something, I'm gonna keep digging until I get it, and I'm gonna keep researching it and, until I find a solution. And I also think too that, like, I think I literally called, like, 7 or 8 lawyers and ended up finding one out of state. Thankfully, life insurance is not state restricted. But everyone that I called, as soon as they heard alcohol, it was like, "Nope," and majority of them didn't even really deal with accidental death, even though that was kind of like their niche. It was more they dealt with disability. So even when they started to consider it, the minute alcohol was brought into the equation, they were like, "Yeah, no." So I think that
Hmm.
also just that natural personality of I'm going to keep digging until I get the answer that I know is there's gotta be somebody out there that can deal with this, right? Like, I can't be the only person that's experienced this. And, but it would have been very easy to give up after, like, the first couple people who said, "No, you don't have a case." But I just knew deep down that, like, I you know, I knew that it wasn't a result of chronic disease. I also knew that, like, he isn't the only person that's died from this. So, like, there's gotta
Hmm.
be somebody that can fight this, but it was a long process.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we did
And
get that
so we
independent.
have
Oh, go
the
ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say we have the independent medical examiner's review, like his report, and it's actually laid out very eloquently. Obviously, because he's a professional, but I thought it would be interesting for people if we just read it, and it did. I mean, it confirmed exactly what you thought, that that the original report was incorrect, and he points it out. He actually uses, and we'll get there, but he actually quotes the a guide for the classification of manner of death by the National Association of Medical Examiners as to why this should have been ruled as an accidental death. But
Mhm.
so we'll just go into it. I'll leave names out of it just for the sake of privacy and all that. But this was a forensic pathologist, and he um, I'll just read a little bit about his experience and why he was perfect for kind of this case. But he's a licensed physician, board certified in the specialties of anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology, and has practiced pathology and conducted autopsies for approximately 30 years. He had performed over 8,400 autopsies in his career and certified deaths in over 10,000 cases. Of those cases, over 1,400 were accidental and suicidal overdose deaths, including the cases of acute alcohol intoxication. Um, and then he said that my opinions are based upon consideration of the records and materials listed below, as well as my training, experience, and current practice as a consultant in forensic pathology. And so he reviewed the medical records from basically all the medical records, the medical examiner's autopsy report, the toxicology reports, the copy of the death certificate, and the police report.
Yeah, everything
Um,
associated with the case.
mhm. Now, so he says, after reviewing the case, I have reached the following opinions and observations. And he lists, he's got five or four um, kind of observations and opinions. So the first one is that Eric, a 38-year-old man, died sometime on March 7th, 2018, from acute alcohol intoxication. Um, Supported by the circumstantial evidence, alcohol containers on the scene, his history of alcohol abuse, and an extremely high level of alcohol, 0.45 in his blood, taken at the autopsy. Um, it is concluded that he went on an acute binge of drinking, resulting in excessive alcohol consumption and extremely high blood alcohol level and death. The death was the result of acute alcohol intoxication is further supported by the typical autopsy findings of edematous and congested lungs and markedly distended bladder, which indicate that he was likely unconscious from his intoxication for a period of time prior to his actual death. Brain swelling is also supportive evidence of this. The second conclusion, Mr. Stremke, Eric did not die from chronic alcoholism. Alcoholism is associated with the inability to reasonably control one's drinking and therefore leads to excessive consumption. However, the assertion that alcoholism caused him to drink so much that he died is highly speculative. If this was true, one would expect all alcoholics to die of acute alcohol intoxication at a young age. There are many potential reasons why someone would drink too much, and it is an oversimplification to merely blame it on alcoholism. One may drink too much because one is depressed, or to escape reality, relieve stress, or to simply feel better. One may not even be aware of how much one is consuming, regardless of whether one is an alcoholic or not. Therefore, I cannot support the idea that chronic alcoholism caused his death. He died of an acute alcohol intoxication, and the reasons he drank to excess at that particular time are purely speculative. Furthermore, the autopsy did not show evidence of liver failure, pancreatitis, internal bleeding, or any other significant alcohol related disease that could account for his death or that would even indicate heavy chronic alcohol abuse. The fact that he was able to hold down a job and had not to seek medical treatment for his alcohol prior problem prior to December 2017 also support the contention that he was not a habitually heavily everyday alcohol abuser. It is much more likely he was a binge drinker and was on a binge at the time of his death. 3. There was no evidence to indicate that Eric died of any other cause. Other than his alcohol abuse, he seemed to be generally healthy. This conclusion is backed up by the autopsy findings. Specifically, he did not have significant alcoholic liver disease, which would be expected in someone with heavy chronic alcohol abuse. In fact, based on the autopsy findings and previous laboratory tests, his liver disease would have been considered quite mild. It is my opinion his liver findings were consistent with his history of periodic alcohol abuse, not consistent abuse, and did not contribute or cause his death in any way. Although he had what was listed as 3 out of 4 atherosclerosis of the left anterior descending coronary artery, this is not further defined, and all other atherosclerotic findings were listed as mild. It should be noted that this grading scale is not common in the practice of pathology. The usual standard is estimate the percentage of luminal narrowing of the artery or at least give a percentage rate. The autopsy showed an otherwise unremarkable heart, and there was no evidence of significant pathology from his other medical conditions, such as hypertension. 4. The death should have been classified as an accident. Traditionally, in my experience, deaths from acute alcohol intoxication are classified on death certificates as an accident. Why Eric's was listed as natural is a mystery to me. According to a guide for the classification of manner of death by the National Association of Medical Examiners, a nationally recognized and respected organization for forensic pathologists, medical examiners, and death investigators, and then he quotes two particular passages from that. One says, consequences of chronic substance abuse, such as alcoholic cirrhosis, alcohol withdrawal seizures, endocarditis secondary to chronic IV drug abuse, and emphysema associated with smoking, have been traditionally designated as natural manner. The argument is often made that these deaths are chronic poisonings or that they result from continuous exposure to external agents and are, therefore, not natural deaths. Further, some argue that there is a sub-intent to do self-harm. However, the classifications of such deaths as natural has a long history, widespread acceptance, and recognition that such behaviors result in diseases and have and become a part of the person's normal lifestyle, which often includes psychiatric elements such as dependency or addictive disorder. For these latter reasons, classification as natural death seems most appropriate. So what that's saying is essentially when somebody is has chronic substance abuse, they end up with um, diseases as a result of their lifestyle, quote unquote. Um, and those diseases are what end up causing their death, and those diseases would be ruled as natural. Um,
I thought it was
so not
interesting
an
too.
overdose,
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because I think when I was hearing you read that, it said that according to the classification manual, those diseases aren't actually considered natural. However, it's widely accepted among medical examiners when someone has this lifestyle choice that leads to these diseases that would be considered a natural death. So even the
right?
actual classification manual doesn't technically list them as natural deaths either. However, it's just a widely accepted practice at this point because of the I mean, it is
Commonality, probably,
and it's true. I mean, the reality is that lifestyle choices affect all sorts of disease
right?
processes. So, any habits that a person picks up can ultimately affect their ability to, they might have diseases that result from that, later on in life. And so, I mean, I think
Mhm.
that logically makes sense, but I think that's what he's pointing out is that, you know, in those cases, yes, that, logically makes sense. However, like this case does not follow that logic. There's no evidence of any of that.
Mhm. Well, and that gets brought up in the next point, but also, on that point, yeah, I mean, the reason why those lifestyle choices result in a natural death, obviously they cause disease. So like when you smoke, right? When you smoke for years and years and years, you can develop lung cancer, you can develop COPD or emphysema, or any of these kind of major lung issues, along with a bunch of other diseases that can result from that. Um, but nobody classifies you dying from lung cancer as an accidental death, because that's a disease, even though it was caused unintentionally by smoking, right? But it's still a lifestyle that resulted in that chronic kind of disease. And that goes with all sorts of different lifestyle choices that people make that unintentionally cause diseases you know
Yeah, and genetics
I
affect
mean,
that. I mean, there's so many.
heart disease, diabetes, all of those sorts of things are the most common things in our society for cause of death. And most of those things are caused by various lifestyle choices. And I mean, genetics play a role in everything
Yep.
too. But, you know, a lot of the most common diseases that people die from can be prevented by lifestyle choices.
Yeah,
And so that's kind
exactly.
of what this is pointing out. And so then the next part um, goes directly into acute intoxication, which again is quoted from the classification of manner of death uh, book, the guide. It says deaths directly due to the acute toxic effects of a drug or poison, i.e., poisoning, such as acute alcohol poisoning, excited delirium from acute cocaine intoxication, or cardiac dysrhythmia due to tricyclic antidepressant toxicity, have been traditionally classified as an accident, assuming there was no intent to do self harm or cause death. In general, these are adverse acute events involving external factors, and the occurrence of the adverse event is not planned, reasonably expected, or reliably predicted as to time, place, or person. The difficulty often encountered is whether the drug or substance detected represents an acute exposure. And then it gives an example, which is not very important. Also, I don't know how to pronounce that word, so I'm not going to try. Uh, um, but it says the issues involved are highly dependent on the substance involved, are beyond the scope of this guide, and are better left to other publications. But it says, suffice it to say that if death results from an acute intoxication and the death was unintentional, tradition and logic indicate that the manner of death is best classified as accident. And so it says Erick's death was not the result of any consequence of chronic substance alcohol abuse, but was due to the acute toxic effects of a drug or poison, in this case, alcohol. Therefore, the manner should have been classified as an accident. Furthermore, I do not see any justification for why the term chronic was included in the cause of death listed on the death certificate. So here, again, even it perfectly coincides with your gut feeling and your want for that bit of justice, in that, like, the chronic part shouldn't have been listed on his death certificate. It should have been ruled an accidental death. Here we have a professional who is very clearly well qualified for this case agreeing with that.
Mhm.
And so, but then again, that's not something, like, we can't, like you said before, we can't change his death certificate. So
No.
now, on there forever, that's what it's known. That's what it says that he died from, was a chronic alcohol abuse problem, and that's not accurate. It's not
Right.
true. Um,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and I think that, I think the important thing too is to remember that it's not like I found a lawyer and then we paid this medical examiner to agree with what we thought was there. It was this lawyer said, "Yeah, it makes sense to me However, the first step we have to do is get an independent medical exam to look at the case and see if there's any merit there. So the medical examiner, had it been very clear that Eric died from chronic alcohol abuse, then he would have just
We
been
wouldn't have
like,
had a case.
I can't support this. There's no findings that support that it was accidental. So I think that's
Right.
important to clarify too.
And so here's the conclusion that he wrote. It says, in conclusion, all evidence supports the finding that Eric died of an acute alcohol intoxication. There was no contributing factors or evidence that his death was caused by any other condition. Uh, that Eric had a problem with alcohol abuse is not disputed. However, the evidence did not show that he had significant pre-existing disease or compromised physical status from his alcoholism or any other condition that made him more susceptible from dying to from acute alcohol intoxication. Anyone with his degree of intoxication, regardless of their history or pre-existing conditions, would be at high risk for death.
Mhm.
So I think that that point is obvious too. No one's disputing that he had an alcohol abuse problem, but the evidence did not show that the abuse problem that he had caused any chronic illness that would have resulted in his death. And that's the important distinction. And again, like, a lot of people, might kind of be like, well, why is this such a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because, again, it's not accurate. So, like, it's not true what's on his death certificate.
And this is
And
somebody we
B,
love, so, like, we also
right,
want things to be accurate for his sake.
right. But B, it's important because it became a legal issue.
Mhm.
We had to fight to get, I mean, I should say, not we. I didn't really have much of a part in this, but you had to fight to get, the life insurance that you were owed, um because they inaccurately, um you know gave a conclusion on his cause of death. The
Right.
initial medical examiner was
Yeah.
inaccurate with their assessment, and because of that, it affected our lives and our grieving, like, and our ability to support your ability to support us, and our family. Uh,
Right.
After going through one of the most traumatic things that either of us have ever gone through, so, um, it's just having that blanket, that cushion,
Mhm.
financially afterwards, is something that takes a lot of stress off of people. That's the whole point of life insurance, right? And to have that taken away over, you know, a bias or a mistake on a autopsy report, um, caused all of these problems
Yeah.
for us,
And there was the thing
for
too is there
you.
just literally is no way to challenge it. So like there was no option except to try to find a lawyer, to have to pay a lawyer to fight the case because I looked and maybe it's different in other states, but in our state there was no the only way that you could challenge a death certificate and have it changed is if it was part of a criminal court proceeding, and meaning that that particular person um, died as a result of a crime, and during the court process, they um, unveiled that there was a different cause of death, then the death certificate be updated. But that's the only way that a death certificate gets changed in the state that we're from at that time. Now, maybe it's changed, but 5.5 years ago, trust me, I scoured and talked, and I think I even called the medical examiners, like, how, I don't agree with this ruling. And there is absolutely no way to challenge it, to write the medical examiner to ask for, a consideration to change it with supporting evidence. I mean, our only option was to try to find a lawyer or just be like, oh, well, I guess we're screwed now.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I think it's important to note too that like when this independent medical examiner came back with this original sort of recap ruling of his interpretation of the entire situation. Uh there were two separate accidental death and disability policies. One was smaller, one was larger. And, interestingly enough, again, these particular there was like a fuzz. I was like, oh, that looks funny. um, Interestingly enough, it's again, you can see how they try to find these loopholes to deny it, because the one that had a smaller amount on it with just that original report from the independent medical examiner changed its ruling and paid out the policy. The larger amount one still denied it even after that one, and I believe, and I don't know if I have the second report or not, but the medical examiner had to go back again because they sent back, I don't even remember, there were a couple things. They were like, "No, this is why we, agree with the original ruling." And then it was like a back and forth. So, you know, it's not it was a long process.
Yeah, so even though we had, this medical examiner who laid it out very clearly and even again quoted official sources as to like why the ruling was incorrect, it was still a legal battle that was went back and like they, you know, based on me reading that, it seems very clear to me that like the initial, you know, um the initial autopsy report was, or the conclusion of the initial autopsy report, I should say, was incorrect or at least inaccurate, right? Um, and yet they still fought it like, no, we agree with the first one, and it's like, well, it doesn't
Yeah,
really
and
matter.
they
You're
came
agreeing with the first one because you don't want to pay out, but that's not
yeah.
what's accurate.
And the reasons they came back with, I remember, were really like minute, kind of stupid points. And the attorney is just like, no, they're just trying to, scare us into backing off because I think they know that we have a case. So he's like, it's not a big
Yep.
deal. We just have the independent medical examiner has to basically, reply to this dispute from, the second denial. Um
Hmm.
and which they did. But I think the thing that, what happens then is this was a long drawn out process. I mean, I think it was at least 6 or 7 months after the death certificate. So, that's like 9 months after his death before we started to get any resolution on this.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was, you know, um, and trying to do all of that while also trying to deal with the aftermath of him dying, and then also, still having to work and still having to go to school and still having to just deal with daily life. Like,
Hmm.
you know, I think I've said more than once, but like I didn't have the energy to initiate with my friends anymore. I know you didn't have the energy for anything extra. And I mean, there's a reason for that. It's because all of these things compile and they become exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah, because that was the thing too, is I was, same thing as you. You were 5 weeks away from graduating high school. I was 5 weeks away from graduating nursing school. And I was just like, I'm not repeating this because I knew it would just never happen. I knew that it was going to get worse in the coming years before it would get better. Um, and, I think this is part of that shock piece that people don't really recognize in year one, especially for like the spouse or the
The
other
immediate
adult.
next of kin.
Yeah, the one that has to take care of all the stuff, the administrative stuff that comes with death, is that I didn't have time to process what was going on. I had to
Mhm.
essentially just jump immediately into that, again, what I call crisis manager mode, to fight for whatever it is that needed to be fought for. So, and we're going
Mhm.
to talk about
Well,
that in one of the upcoming episodes, is how that sort of delayed my grief and caused some challenges for you and I. But yeah, I mean, this whole process was, again, I look back at it and I'm just like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did all of that. But I was just like this, I was determined to make sure that it was right.
yeah, I mean, I think, that's definitely a topic that we're gonna touch on soon. maybe even next episode is I was able to kind of deal with a lot of my, not, I shouldn't say deal with my grief, like, but I was able to kind of sit in it more immediately. I still had my responsibilities. I still had to finish school. I still, was working and all of that stuff. You know, immediately following, but then I had the summer off, right? And um, I was able to just kind of sit in it and like actually feel what I was feeling. And not that that's a fun experience by any means, but I got to do that a lot sooner than you did because
Mhm.
you were dealing with all of the, like you said, the administrative stuff and all, and it takes months and months. And I mean, it was almost a full year before a lot of the things were resolved. And then on top of that, it's like, you know, eventually going through his stuff. Like, I don't think we went through any of his stuff for like years.
Yeah,
Um,
not from well, his stuff, yeah, his clothing. I mean, I think we went through a few things, but like I didn't go through
mhm,
his clothing until I sold the house, which was in 2021, right? Yeah.
Well, and
Um
he had all of his work stuff. He had all of his work stuff like in our garage, and he had, you know,
we didn't do any of that for years. Even the stuff that came from the hotel, I mean, other than me doing a brief cursory look through and grabbing things that were important like his phone and his laptop and you know, doing a brief kind of look to make
mhm,
sure to see if there was any information that would help me understand what had happened. Um, it all just got shoved in the closet, and then I didn't take it out again
right,
until I was getting ready to move from the house.
yeah, yeah, and so like, I, I think it is an interesting point of, I think you've said this multiple times, at least to me, that it's very widely accepted that the second year is usually the worst for widows and widowers because that's really when, again, like all the administrative and all of the adult things that need to be taken care of finally kind of subside, and then you're left to just sit in it finally.
Mhm.
And you know
Yeah, the shock wears off, and then it's like you realize it's your new reality. So
yeah,
yeah, which we'll
whereas
talk.
again for me,
Yeah,
it was a lot more immediate because um I was a teenager. I didn't have to
yeah,
deal with it wasn't necessarily my responsibility to have to deal with all of the things that you did,
right.
you know.
Yeah. I think yeah, so I think the lesson, that I took forward from this too is just obviously being aware of the differences between the types of policies and the types of problems that they can cause if something like that were to happen. And then also just recognizing I think, again, like I said, I was very not that I think that you should withhold information from a medical examiner, but like some of the questions that I look at now, again, I'm, immediately in shock. It's like the day of later, the same day. And I didn't have any reason to question what they were asking me. You know what I mean? So like I think
Mhm.
that's some of those things that happen too is you get, I look back on it now and it's like, well, I probably would have answered some of that differently or would have been like, how is this relevant? Um, but I had no reason to question why they were asking. And I also still was just trying to process that this was even happening in the first place.
I think it's also just an important lesson on preparation because, you know, these sorts of things happen at times that you least expect them.
Mhm.
And, there's all sorts of things that you should be prepared for. I mean, even just look at like natural disasters and stuff. It seems like there's one every week these days, and
Mhm.
they affect millions and millions of people. And it's like, if you have people that you look after or you have people that rely on you for anything, you know, you have to think about, like, if something happens to me, what happens to them? Um, and not everybody does, or not everybody takes the time to prepare, or they think I can prepare later. I'll get it done later. And then sometimes it never does, and it's too late. So it's
Yeah.
just an important reminder for people to hope for the best, but always be prepared for the worst. And especially if you have a family that, you know, you rely on or that relies on you, um, to be prepared if anything happens.
Later on, when I worked with a financial advisor after his death, when I was trying to figure out how to set up stuff going forward, the advice that I got was when you're thinking about life insurance, if the person who is the beneficiary of your life insurance is going to be affected by your loss of income, as in like you not being around anymore impacts their ability to live, you want to take a certain amount, and you want to think about like, at minimum a year, if not a little bit longer, but you want to have enough insurance that would replace that income, and preferably replace both incomes for a certain period of time, because of the fact that, again, when somebody dies and this happens, I mean, that other person is probably not going to be working either. So, um and it's not like you have to have excessive big life insurance policies, but also just make sure that they're adequate, because I mean, yes, every little bit helps, but also if you don't have enough, that creates its own stresses as well.
Well, and you know what? Like, ultimately, too, even though it was a legal battle and it lasted for way longer than it should have, that cushion still did give you extra, um, well, exactly that, an extra cushion so that you did have time to grieve. Like that second year, you didn't have to work quite as much as you would have otherwise
Right.
because you had that cushion and it gave you the time that you needed to get through some of those things. And it's always an ongoing process and whatnot. But like, I very much empathize with people who don't have those luxuries or provisions um, of having that cushion when something like this happens, and they do just have to go to work, and they do just have to uproot their lives, and they get no time
I can't
to
even imagine.
actually grieve. And then that affects their emotional state and their mental health and all of those things for the rest of their life. Like those are the types of things that cause PTSD and some of these sorts of traumatic disorders and whatnot, because they're not allowed any time to actually work through the big traumatic things that have happened to them because they have to just survive. And when you go into survival mode, all of that other stuff goes out the window. But again, like you always say, your goal is to thrive, not just survive, right?
Right.
And that's kind of the goal of this podcast, is to help people do that, help
Hmm.
people to understand, empathize, but also to learn from learn from our situation and hopefully be able to
Yeah, and I think
gain something
find some
from
sort
it.
of healing or resolution for themselves. We've gotten a lot of feedback from people, not only who've experienced this type of loss, but also just people who struggle with various traumas or mental health or situations themselves. And so I think that despite the actual situation, the actual experience, a lot of what we experienced in terms of the mental health part of it, the grief afterwards, the process of dealing with something really traumatic is kind of universal. A lot of people can relate to those things because a lot of it's very similar in terms of the after effects when anything really big and traumatic happens. And I want to go back to just also, I think it's important for people to know and that if they're thinking in their gut, you know, they know that something is wrong or not right, or that there's got to be a better solution for something, to not like give up. Because I think the thing is that like there is information out there, you can eventually find it, but the internet is not always going to give it to you the first time, right? Like when you put in a search term, you might not get the types of results you're looking for. And so you have to kind of, I think, my grandma's always just like, how do you find this stuff? And I'm just like, because they don't take the first the first answer or the second answer. It's like I just keep changing and keep looking until I find what I'm looking for. And so like, and a lot of it is because I have this sense of I know that I can't be the only person that's dealt with this, or there's got to be somebody that knows something about this, or there, and I mean, you think of like us being connected in a world of 8 billion people, like somebody has to have some information somewhere. So I've always naturally been that type of person. And it served me well during this situation because, like I said, I think he was like the eighth lawyer before I finally found this guy. And he was based out of California. And again, I could have just assumed, well, he's based out of California. I'm in Minnesota. So like, it's not gonna, he's not gonna take my case. Um, but at that point, I think I had done enough research because I was looking for lawyers. I realized that life insurance is not restricted to the state. It's a federal, cross states. Um, so I'm thankful that I was able to recognize that because I wouldn't have found him otherwise. There was nobody. I looked all over Minnesota and I did not find one person that dealt with this type of thing, or if they did deal with accidental death and disability, they mostly dealt with disability, maybe a couple cut and dry accidental deaths, but nothing complicated. And the minute you brought in alcohol, they were just like, again, that stigma comes into play. Like, nope, like that's not a case. We don't have a case. Um, and I will forever be thankful to this attorney because he um, he asked really good questions, and I think that was important is, I had to try to explain, why I thought I had a case when I would call these attorneys and try to find out if they could even handle it, and the minute I brought up alcohol, everyone else was just like, "Nope," and they wouldn't even let me explain why I thought the ruling was incorrect. It was just like, "Nope, I don't wanna deal with this." But then this attorney I started to say what I was saying, and, I when I found him in his website, like, you can see that he dealt with a lot of, like, accidental death, so he definitely was the right person, to work with, um, because he did his specialty was more the accidental death side of things, and then when I called him and talked to him and gave him the synopsis, instead of just being like, "Nope, that's not we don't deal with that." He goes, "Tell me more as to why you think that this is the case." And then I was able to go through like the autopsy findings and the supporting evidence that said that this is not. And as soon as we were done with that, what, like 10-minute phone call, he was just like, "Oh, yeah." He's like, "This is definitely accidental." He was just like, "There's no," he goes, I've seen thousands of autopsy reports where someone dies from chronic drug use or chronic alcohol abuse, and their autopsies don't look like this. So that in itself was validating. And then the other thing that was important to note is that I knew I was on the right track because this attorney, outside of having to pay for and get an independent medical exam on my own, he did not take payment unless he won the case. And so that's a very important distinction as well. So, like, there was no incentive for him to take my case unless he thought that it was a valid case that he could win. Um, because he didn't get paid unless we won and got those insurance policies turned around. So, um, I'm glad that I have that internal drive to just not take no for an answer when I know something is wrong or something is right. Um, but I think it's just an important lesson for other people that if you just know that there's something, that needs to be different, to just keep pushing because there is somebody out there that knows something about what you're dealing with. But it's not always easy to find information. It's not always easy to find those people. So sometimes you just have to keep looking and keep looking and keep looking until you find what you're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we can end it there, and um next episode we'll probably talk about kind of our different experiences over those following years in terms of how we dealt with the aftermath.
Hey, you know how this works.
If you like this episode or just like us in general, you can find us at It's Going Podcast on all the things.
Don't forget to check out the links in the description.
And thanks for hanging out with us.